Hi, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta. I'm in the social science program, and the purpose of this video is to talk about how to use text and analyze text to look for elements of social structure within it. What are the elements of social structure? Individuals who are named, so they have identity, and they also have attributes that are associated with their individuality. Second, relations between pairs of individuals. And then third, affiliations, that is group membership, organization membership, institution membership, affiliations to entities that contain more than two individuals and are more than simply the set of individuals, but create something larger than the individuals themselves. To do this, let's take a look at the text of an 1811 novel by Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility. We'll look at chapter 1. And I want to acknowledge two things. First of all, that you can find the text of this novel at Project Gutenberg. If you type in a search engine, Project Gutenberg, 1811, Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility, you can get it to read for free. Second, I want to acknowledge that the idea of using a Jane Austen novel as text to understand social structure is the idea of Professor Jennifer Golbeck of the University of Maryland, who has written an excellent book called Analyzing the Social Web as a way of thinking about breaking down social text in order to understand it. So I'm standing on the shoulders of that acknowledged expert. Let's start by reading the first chapter of Sense and Sensibility. And as you do so, I'd like you to try to think of what those individuals are, to list those. As you hear attributes, try to list those, and think about relations. Where do relations exist? How are they referred to? Try to write those down, and then try to write down what are the groups, what are the affiliations, the things that are higher than an individual to which these individuals in this very short introductory chapter belong. So here we go, chapter 1 of Sense and Sensibility. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Their estate was large, and their residence was at Norland Park, in the centre of their property, where for many generations they had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintance. The late owner of this estate was a single man who lived to a very advanced age, and who for many years of his life had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. But her death, which happened 10 years before his own, produced a great alteration in his home. For to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. In the society of his nephew and niece, and their children, the old gentleman's days were comfortably spent. His attachment to them all increased. The constant attention of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Dashwood to his wishes, which proceeded not merely from interest but from goodness of heart, gave him every degree of solid comfort which his age could receive. And the cheerfulness of the children added a relish to his existence. By a former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, by his present lady 3 daughters. The son, a steady, respectable young man, was amply provided for by the fortune of his mother, which had been large, and half of which devolved on him in his coming of age. By his own marriage, likewise, which happened soon afterwards, he added to his wealth. To him, therefore, the succession to the Norland estate was not really so important as to his sisters, for their fortune, independent of what might arise to them from their father's inheriting that property, could be but small. Their mother had nothing, and their father only £7,000 in his own disposal, for the remaining moiety of his first wife's fortune was also secured to her child, and he had only a life interest in it. Now the old gentleman died. His will was read, and like almost every other will, gave as much disappointment as pleasure. He was neither so unjust nor so ungrateful as to leave his estate from his nephew, but he left it to him on such terms as destroyed half the value of the bequest. Mr. Dashwood had wished for it more for the sake of his wife and daughters than for himself or his son. But to his son and his son's son, a child of 4 years old, it was secured in such a way as to leave himself no power of providing for those who were most dear to him, and who most needed a provision, by any charge on the estate, or by any sale of its valuable woods. The whole was tied up for the benefit of this child, who, in occasional visits with his father and mother at Norland, had so far gained on the affections of his uncle by such attractions as are by no means unusual in children of 2 or 3 years old. An imperfect articulation, an earnest desire of having his own way, many cunning tricks, and a great deal of noise, as to outweigh all the value of all the attention which, for years, he had received from his niece and her daughters. He meant not to be unkind, however, and as a mark of his affection for the 3 girls, he left them £1,000 apiece. Mr. Dashwood's disappointment was at first severe, but his temper was cheerful and sanguine, and he might reasonably hope to live many years, and by living economically lay by a considerable sum from the produce of an estate already large and capable of almost immediate improvement. But the fortune, which had been so tardy in coming, was his only one 12-month. He survived his uncle no longer, and £10,000, including the late legacies, was all that remained for his widow and daughters. His son was sent for as soon as his danger was known, and to him Mr. Dashwood recommended, with all the strength and urgency which illness could command, the interest of his mother-in-law and sisters. Mr. John Dashwood had not the strong feelings of the rest of the family, but he was affected by a recommendation of such a nature at such a time, and he promised to do everything in his power to make them comfortable. His father was rendered easy by such an assurance, and Mr. John Dashwood had then leisure to consider how much there might prudently be in his power to do for them. He was not an ill-disposed young man, unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish is to be ill-disposed. But he was, in general, well respected, for he conducted himself with propriety in the discharge of his ordinary duties. Had he married a more amiable woman, he might have been made still more respectable than he was. He might have even been made amiable himself, for he was very young when he married, and very fond of his wife. But Mrs. John Dashwood was a strong caricature of himself, more narrow-minded and selfish. When he gave his promise to his father, he meditated within himself to increase the fortunes of his sisters by the present of £1,000 apiece. He then really thought himself equal to it. The prospect of £4,000 a year, in addition to his present income, besides the remaining half of his own mother's fortune, warmed his heart, and made him feel capable of generosity. Yes, he would give them £3,000. It would be liberal and handsome. It would be enough to make them completely easy. £3,000 he could spare so considerable a sum with little inconvenience. He thought of it all day long and for many days successively, and he did not repent. No sooner was his father's funeral over than Mrs. John Dashwood, without sending any notice of her intention to her mother-in-law, arrived with her child and their attendants. No one could dispute her right to come. The house was her husband's from the moment of his father's decease. But the indelicacy of her conduct was so much the greater, and to a woman in Mrs. Dashwood's situation, with only common feelings, must have been highly unpleasing. But in her mind there was a sense of honor so keen, a generosity so romantic, that any offense of the kind, by whomsoever, given or received, was to her a source of immovable disgust. Mrs. John Dashwood had never been a favourite with any of her husband's family, but she had had no opportunity till the present of showing them with how little attention to the comfort of other people she could act when occasion required it. So acutely did Mrs. Dashwood feel this ungracious behaviour, and so earnestly did she despise her daughter-in-law for it, that, on the arrival of the latter, she would have quitted the house forever, had not the entreaty of her eldest girl induced her first to reflect on the propriety of going, and her own tender love for all her 3 children determined her afterwards to stay, and for their sakes avoid a breach with their brother. Eleanor, this eldest daughter, whose advice was so effectual, possessed a strength of understanding and coolness of judgment which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counsellor of her mother, and enabled her frequently to counteract, to the advantage of them all, that eagerness of mind that in Mrs. Dashwood which must generally have led to imprudence. She had an excellent heart. Her disposition was affectionate, and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was a knowledge which her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. Marianne's abilities were in many respects quite equal to Eleanor's. She was sensible and clever, but eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys, could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. The resemblance between her and her mother was strikingly great. Now, Eleanor saw, with concern, the excess of her sister's sensibility, but by Mrs. Dashwood it was valued and cherished. They encouraged each other now in the violence of their affliction. The agony of grief, which overpowered them at first, was voluntarily renewed, was sought for, was created again and again. They gave themselves up wholly to their sorrow, seeking increase of wretchedness in every reflection that could afford it, and resolved against ever admitting consolation in the future. Eleanor, too, was deeply afflicted, but still she could struggle. She could exert herself. She could consult with her brother, could receive her sister-in-law on her arrival and treat her with proper attention, and could strive to rouse her mother to similar exertion and encourage her to similar forbearance. Margaret, the other sister, was a good-humoured, well-disposed girl, but as she had already imbibed a good deal of Marianne's romance, without having much of her sense, she did not, at 13, bid fair to equal her sisters at a more advanced period of life. Okay, that's the first chapter of Sense and Sensibility. And now we need to think about who were the individuals that were mentioned there. What are the relations and what are the affiliations? And before we do that, let's notice the difference between explicit notice and implicit notice. There is one implicit notice in the first sentence, which is a second sentence, which is a long sentence, referring to engaging the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintance. Now, there's not an individual in there, right? It's just a collectivity. So the surrounding acquaintances there. Even more, but they're not explicitly named as individuals, so we can't name them as individuals. We don't know who they are. We don't know their names. We don't know where they live. We don't know their character, their attributes. The second implicit presence is the presence of those individuals who would create the income of an estate. Clearly, the estate has value and it has a production, but that's named in this 1811 novel in a passive sense. So it's important for us to note that we're not going to be able to track in any regard, in any explicit way, who those individuals are. Who are the servants? Who are the people who are working presumably in some fields associated there, who are doing hunting to produce food, who are the bookkeepers, who are the housekeepers, and others of that sort. And that's important to keep in mind when you're doing a social analysis. And to draw the boundary here. Boundary specification is the notion of who can we include in an analysis of a text and who can't we include. And when we get specific, we can't include the general acquaintance and all those people who are working at the Norland estate. In a general sense, we can note their presence and simply note that it's a mystery that is not solved by Jane Austen. And so we only can work with the individuals who are specifically named in the text. So to do this work, we can take a look at individuals and groups as I've extracted them from the text. And let's take a look at groups first. In this list that I read three primary groups that are sets of affiliations to which individuals belong, which are the Dashwood family, the Norland estate, and Sussex itself as a place, as a community. Now, the Dashwood family and the Norland estate, right, are not the same because there are members of the Dashwood family who do not live at the Norland estate, right? So, and they can visit the Norland estate from time to time, but they don't all live there. And Norland estate is part of Sussex, so Sussex is a much bigger place, and it contains the Norland estate, but is not limited to it. Within the Dashwood family, we can also consider the nuclear birth family of the old gentleman and his sister who comes to serve as caretaker of the house for a long time. There's a second nuclear birth family of Mr. Henry Dashwood and his first wife, then the nuclear birth family of Mr. Henry Dashwood and his second wife, and finally the nuclear birth family of Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood. And these are all overlapping groups where there are some individuals, such as Mr. Henry Dashwood, who's in two of those. Mr. John Dashwood would be in the nuclear birth family of Mr. Henry Dashwood and his first wife, but also a member of his own family. So there are overlaps, but there are these subgroups that fit underneath the Dashwood family. And then there are individuals. And I put a letter next to each one of them so I could kind of keep track, because what's interesting is that they're not all named, and it's interesting to me when we read the Sense and Sensibility to consider which individuals get a name and which individuals don't, and are only referred to by their position. So we have the old gentleman, never have an idea what his name is. It could be Jacob, it could be who knows what. And the old gentleman's sister. Then there's Mr. Henry Dashwood and Mr. Henry Dashwood's second wife. Then there's John Dashwood, Mrs. John Dashwood. And then there's Margaret Dashwood, Marianne Dashwood, Eleanor Dashwood, their mother, who is Mr. Henry Dashwood's first wife. We don't know her name in this chapter. Just like we don't know Mrs. John Dashwood's name, or the name of Mr. Henry Dashwood's second wife, who is, by the way, that's the mother of Margaret, Marianne, and Eleanor. And then there's Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood's child. We also don't know the name of that child. And not knowing the name is an indication of perhaps relative importance, or that perhaps the position is more important than the personality of the individual. But those are the individuals that I see named. And because these are lists that are relatively small, we can, I think, 11 individuals and 3 main groups with 4 subgroups. We can work with those and recognize those fairly easily. But when we move on to thinking about relations, as we'll find here, as I see them, we could present them in an edge list, a set of relationships in pairs. So there's quite a few of those relations. In that first chapter, what we're seeing set up is a rather long array of relations, and I won't read them off, but you can review them here, and we'll scroll through, and we'll see that they go on and on and on and this is quite a complicated set of relations. In fact, it's so complicated that we can't see the structure simply by listing the pairs of people who are connected. There's just too many for us to pay attention to in our own psychology. We can't see that. Perhaps we could see that Mr. Henry Dashwood, right, seems to have more relations to others than the old gentleman does. But what's really important for us to note is the pattern. And so to show that pattern, what we can do is create a social network graph that takes the same information in that list and puts all of it together in one picture. So that every time we have a connection from, say, Margaret Dashwood to someone else, there's going to be a line going from that first person, Margaret Dashwood, to that second person. For instance, Margaret Dashwood was in this same house and was providing cheer to the old gentleman before the old gentleman died. So we know that there's a relationship between Margaret Dashwood and the old gentleman, and there's a line there. What we see here is that there are some individuals who are more central than others. For instance, the old gentleman's sister really is listed as only having one relationship in this text, and that is to the old gentleman himself, whereas the old gentleman has many relations to others. Mr. Henry Dashwood's second wife, as yet unnamed, has many relationships, and and then there are some that are in between, excuse me, such as Mr. Henry Dashwood's first wife, who is mentioned glancingly as having been married to Mr. Henry Dashwood and has having been the mother of John Dashwood. And that's all the relations that we get. So what we have here in this picture is not just a set of the relations and a listing of them, but a glimpse into the structure and a sense of what the camps are of individuals who are more related to one another, right? So there's Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood and their relations over on one side, and they have many relations with each other. And then there's Mr. Henry Dashwood's second wife, who's connected to many of these different camps, including her own nuclear family, the old gentleman, the family of her husband's first wife. And so clearly she's going to play a role in bridging there, which is pretty interesting. So finally, we can think about individual attributes, right? And so let's think about that in terms of listing and also in terms of structure. So here are some individual attributes described in Sense and Sensibility, Chapter 1. And just as first we listed a set of relationships between individuals as just a list, we could also list for each person the set of attributes, characteristics of the individuals that Jane Austen mentions in this very short first chapter. And there are a number of them. So the old gentleman is described as respectable, as having lived a long time and as being affectionate. The old gentleman's sister, not described very well, as a housekeeper and a companion. Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood's child, at the bottom of this list, has no listed attributes other than being Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood's child. And any attributes that that child has listed are listed as being just the attributes of any 2, 3, or 4-year-old. By the way, notice that the age of the child is kind of a little vague and inconsistent, even. On the other hand, Mr. Henry Dashwood's second wife has a number of characteristics that are particularly ascribed to her personality. Good-hearted, of no fortune, honorable, generous, romantic, loving, eager, imprudent, grieving, sorrowful, and wretched. Marianne also gets a number of characteristics: cheerful, sensible, clever, eager, generous, amiable, interesting, imprudent, grieving, sorrowful and wretched, and romantic. And Eleanor gets some as well. So that's really neat to be able to get an idea of where these are coming from. Perhaps if you were to star in a stage production of Sense and Sensibility, it would be good for you to look at this first chapter and to extract those individual attributes for your character, whether you're John Ashwood, Eleanor Dashwood, or any of the others. But what that list can't do is to describe similarities and differences, right? Notice that there are some words that appear over and over again. There's of large fortune, there's of no fortune, there's romantic that appears again over and over, grieving, sorrowful, wretched, respectable, cheerful. All of these words occur again and again, and in a sense, they create commonalities or linkages between some characters, which is important to know. To highlight that structure, we need a format that can provide us structure, and that format can be the format of a traditional data set. A data set is a table, essentially, in which there are rows and columns being vertical, rows being horizontal, in which rows, each row has a case in it, in this, which is a particular instance of the thing you're studying. So in this case, that would be an individual. So each row has an individual, and then each column represents a variable. A variable means that it is a characteristic that can have different values. And in this table, which you can see here down at the bottom, let's make this larger. Okay, so that we can see it. Good. Let's scroll down. You'll notice that there are zeros and ones, and only zeros and ones, which means that there are two possible values. A zero, typically in a data set, means this is not present. Whatever the variable is, it's not present. And a one means, yes, it is present. So in the upper left-hand corner, we can see the old gentleman, who's an individual, and the characteristic affectionate is present. However, the old gentleman is not described as afflicted. The value of afflicted for the old gentleman is 0. If we want to find someone who is described as afflicted, it would be Eleanor Dashwood, right? So anyone who portrays Eleanor Dashwood in any screen or stage adaptation, you're going to have to keep in mind that despite being attentive, cheerful, cool, forbearing, that beneath that forbearance, there lies an affliction nevertheless. So no one else is listed as afflicted, but we do notice that there are two individuals who are described as affectionate, the old gentleman and Eleanor Dashwood, right? So they both are providing of themselves this affection. They have something in common as individuals. Much more in common is under cheerfulness. That would be Mr. Henry Dashwood, Margaret, Marianne, and Eleanor Dashwood are all described as cheerful. Similarly, commonalities can be seen in the data set. So who's eager? Mr. Henry Dashwood's second wife and her child, Marianne Dashwood. So there's something that those two have in common. And as a matter of fact, they have more than one of those things in common, right? So both are described as generous. Both are described as grieving. And Eleanor gets included in there too. So this table does not simply list what we saw above, but because we can make comparisons between rows, between columns, and look for where there are common instances and where there are differences, we can begin to think about the structure of their personalities, the way they do things. You can do this kind of work really for any text, and I encourage you to do so And when you do that, keep in mind the immediate value of using lists. But the ultimate value, as we think of so many different kinds of attributes or so many different kinds of relations, right? Of placing those attributes into the table, into the structure of a data set, and presenting relations in the form of a graph where we can see the pattern of connections. The patterns are what makes this work really interesting and what makes Jane Austen's novel a particularly effective one. Sense and Sensibility, in its first chapter, is setting up the tensions that are going to play themselves out over the remainder of the text.